Welcome to Dragon Brews. Grab a brew or take one of ours. I don't give a shit. My name's Nick and this is Mike. What's up, Mike?
Hey, man. That's actually not bad. I don't mind the laughter. That's good.
Absolutely. So I would like to start this off with how we cut our teeth on this real quick, just to give a little background. If you want to go first, kind of go into what your first experience with D&D and how long ago that was.
I mean, yeah, I was probably 14, 13. I know my mom for sure drove me, and that was back in the 3.5 days, you know? So I was handed a character sheet, didn't roll one up, just was told, here, you're this guy, and kind of rolled with the punches. Kind of been playing D&D ever since. It's not until after 5e, the advent of Merle's and his beautiful simplifications.
God, yes.
That I actually ventured into DMing, and I've been DMing a 1 through 20 long-form homebrew campaign since... Fuck, what even year was that? 2018?
I think so, yeah. 3 years now almost.
Yeah, we have like 170 hours.
Something ridiculous.
Yeah, and just kind of been chomping at the bit, whatever that saying is. I've been doing that.
I think it's chomping.
Chomping at the bit, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I think the bit is like the thing that goes in the horse's mouth, maybe.
Nick, I gotta be honest, wrong. I don't think I even used the right expression, whether or not I said it right. I've just,
I mean, it sounded right to me.
Yeah, I mean, if I say it confidently, anything can be true.
Oh, yeah.
I've just, been kind of growing in that way, and studying the damn rules. And I have a party full of ne'er-do-well assholes who constantly make me have to figure out things on the fly, basically always. So
this is the way, I believe.
Yeah, this is the way, exactly.
So 3.5, how long did you play originally, the 3.5?
So with 3.5, it's kind of hard to keep continuous scheduled sessions up when you don't live close to your friends that you're playing with. So sporadically, probably from 14 to 15, and then probably when I was around 16, maybe into 17, I started doing because Ventrilo and TeamSpeak were popular. I started doing some over the web type deals with some rudimentary, graphing systems that were around back then. Don't even remember what I don't think Roll20 was around back then. It was a few years out. So I'd played a bunch of 3.5 as a player, and then I skipped 4E entirely.
I love that. So I have a similar experience. I was a player for 3.5. It was my buddy's uncle who threw out these books and said, hey man, check this shit out. This guy was a stoner, right? Traditional DM nerd.
Nice.
And he made me make a character. And I learned the hard way at a young age, at like 14, 15, even younger. I think it was like 12 or 13 maybe, on how to make a character. And it took, I think, 2 days as a kid to make a fucking dual-wielding dragonkin or some shit.
Yeah, 3.5 didn't fuck around in terms of how long it took to make a fucking character.
It was constant flipping back and forth to the back of the manual, looking at all these proficiencies and jobs and shit, and then finally building a character. The experience was fun. It was short-lived, though. It became a 3-person campaign, and then my buddy took over as DM. He had a DM PC, so it was two people DMing, or 2 people playing, which, it's still fun, but after a while you get into a rut. You finish things quickly and you're OP as fuck.
Right.
But I actually came back to it right before, I think, 5th edition came out. So 4th edition I DM'd because I just wanted to play. I drug a bunch of my coworkers into it, and we just played for like, I think, a year-long campaign. Got up to level 5 or 6, maybe 7. And god damn it, dude, 4 was interesting. It still had crunch, but the combat was ridiculously long, like absurd. But yeah, I've been now playing in your campaign for the past 3 years, and actually started an evil campaign. So that's
which I'm
fun.
playing as a player inside of that campaign.
God, yeah, I miss DMing, honestly. But that brings us to, you know, the point here is you and I have had a lot of experience, you know, building our own things, because 5th edition, I think you would agree, it's pretty plain, like, especially after a couple of years of playing it.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's kind of, everything's boiled down to make it more approachable, I think, to the GP, which has a lot of really good merit. You know, it's bringing so many people to this, you know, platform, which is great, because D&D is, by in a way, the greatest game, in my opinion, maybe ever made. Like, that includes video games and such, because there is no limit to what can occur.
Absolutely not. The imagination's the limit, you know.
Right. And I think, you know what I think is really interesting, and I wonder, I would love to ask some other DM friends I have. It's interesting that both of us approach DMing because we just wanted to play, and finding a DM is fucking impossible.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that's what makes a DM, is like, okay, like, when I was a person trying to find a game to play in, like, I went through multiple people, and it was just like, no, everybody's interested, but nobody's a fucking DM. Right. So the moment I was like, I'm running a campaign, instantly it was full. Like, like, I had players out the anus. Even originally, like, there was 5-6 players, and you came over to my desk, and you was like, I'm in. I was like, well, we already have mad players. You're like, yeah, I don't care, I'm playing.
I was thirsty for it, man. Thirsty for it. Because it was years. It was probably almost maybe 3 or 4 years since I'd played as a DM. And the weird thing is, I had the opposite reaction. There's fucking nerds all around me when I worked at the time, because we were all in, you know, communications and whatnot. Right. So I was like, hey, I'm throwing a game. Who wants to play? Fucking nobody. And then even before you came along, I asked everybody at work, like, hey, who wants to play D&D? Fucking nobody. I was like, all right, man, what the fuck? It
is still not fully approachable, I think, to the general nerd community. I think that there's some, because being a nerd has become so mainstream, there's that, like, level of nerd that's like, I'm a gamer, but I play Call of Duty, or like I play one of these big games everybody's talking about. And so finding actual deep cuts nerds is still, it can be a tough thing. And I think that a lot of it is people are embarrassed to, like, play a silly character or, like, act in front of people. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that holds true, but I think in the recent years that's kind of, you know, just like, it's a norm, because, you know, fucking what's this dude's name? His name, you know, slipped on my mind, but that one sexy motherfucker who plays D&D, he's an actor.
Joe Manganiello,
yes.
Joe Manganiello,
yeah. Oh my god, dude!
You only had to say the sexy actor, and I immediately knew who the fuck you meant. That ripped dude with a six-pack who makes fucking D&D cool. Yeah, we all appreciate him.
Yeah, he fucking saved the whole nerdarchy of it all. But yeah, I mean, there is definitely a huge stigma that I think once you get past, it's like, oh, this is just what I do. I role play, you know, I have fun. I let out all my frustrations from the work week. You know, right. You experience something different, and it's a shared collective story. But absolutely. So the whole, why don't you explain a little bit the whole point of our show here then?
Sure.
Roll right into it.
I'll tie into it. The complexities of what became chaos because I decided to be lazy, essentially. So when I decided to DM, rather than study all the 5e lore, I was just like, okay, I will homebrew everything. Like, this world is all homebrew. And so I tied in a bunch of existing lore and then just kind of made stuff up. But then upon just making stuff up, you realize, oh shit, I have to invent things for this to work. And so a homebrew world becomes a big system of checks and balances, and magic items are great, but part of being a DM and having like you as one of the players who is a DM, keeping things like fresh, where like a DM player will get something that they've never heard of because I've created it. It gives that like that deliciousness to whomever is playing. And so a lot of the time creating homebrew items and content in general is just a way that we keep things fresh. And so you and I, since our campaign has had a waiting list and we've gone through some players, we've gained some and then lost some and then gained some more. What we did since our party was, you know, level 6, 7, 8, and I think you guys are level 9 at this point. We made it so any player who's joining that submits a 1-page backstory, we will create 2 unique magical items specifically kind of tailored to what their story says about their character.
Right.
And I think that in implementing that rule, plus dealing with a lot of our players that are come from a video game Diablo world as opposed to a D&D world, and they constantly want new, fresh, fancy loot drops and all that.
Yeah.
We've just kind of had to implement a lot of custom stuff, and the danger there is always balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
I think that there's a ton of content out there, but there's not really content that's explaining how to balance things and
Absolutely.
why one thing is more balanced versus another. Mm-hmm. And I think that we excel in that. And I think that that's really where talking about homebrew overall is where we come in and we make things make a little bit more sense, maybe.
Yeah, because there's a lot of, you know, aspiring DMs there who are just starting out and kind of, you know, look at the player handbook or the Dungeon Master Guide or even Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and they see all these fantastical things.
Or Tasha's, which just throws everything up in the air and goes,
"Oh God,
here's all this new craziness."
Yeah, don't even get me started on that shit. I still haven't gotten over the player submitted content from Tasha's. It's a fucking headache. But a brand new DM coming into it, you know, they see all this stuff and think, "Oh, this is great." You know, I'm gonna throw random loot at them and then see how it goes. And I think the biggest backfire thing to that is these magic items are a lot of them are one dimensional. You know, it's not tailored to your party's composition and what you're comfortable DMing, because in a world where you give a +2 sword to a fighter that also has, you know, some crazy armor or some ring, and you throw the game on its head essentially. So it's really important to understand, you know, the types of homebrews that DMs can implement, you know, because it's a lot of these rules are just suggestions, right? Like, you don't need to pick from a table. Like I hate roll tables, absolutely hate them.
The only time I use roll tables is if they're fully custom designed for a specific purpose.
Exactly, because it's your world and you know what lives there and you know what's going to come out and you know the kind of loot you want to give your players specifically.
Right. But roll tables can get crazy. You're right. Like, there's no chance that a goblin in a dungeon should ever be able to drop something you'd find at the sea. But a roll table can allow for things like that if you're just rolling random shit. Exactly.
And that's where, you know, the importance of homebrewing your own experiences, because it's more than just, oh, I have a class I want to homebrew. You know, it's more than that. It's, you know, we have essentially two types of homebrew on our hands here. We have the one that kind of like spices up the mix, you know, like you have a 3-party composition, your players are getting bored, it's been 2 years, what do you want to do to spice it up? Maybe someone dies and they want to roll a new class, maybe it's something interesting. So I think the biggest first implementation of a homebrew is not looking at all the options there are, but maybe flavoring it differently, right? because that's essentially our first homebrew type that we want to go over right now is simple implementation, something that's not going to turn your game upside down. It's not rolling on a table for loot. It's not building a magic item from scratch, something super specific and balanced, but it's something that is super simple that any new GM or DM could implement and make the game different, make it new, make it more interesting. As crazy as it is now, we have those tools. All the books are just suggestions. They're not rhetoric in stone.
Exactly. And you know what? Even the person in charge of making sure it all makes sense, Mike Merle, says that kind of explicitly. Like, this is kind of like loose guidelines, go crazy. And I feel like because of how, especially for new DMs, complex things can seem, doing that, like going buck wild, like it's very easy to think things seem balanced when they're not, or vice versa. Like think that they're overpowered when they're not. I mean, I could even tag in the disagreement we had over sneak attack.
Oh God.
Like that became a battle because I hated that, and I was like, it does not fucking balance, and we had a fucking argument about it, and you prepared all the data. You're like, here's why it balances, idiot. And I was like, okay, it balances. You're right.
Yeah, and that's how you balance games, right? Like you see, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but you see how other classes stack up against each other without any special anything, right?
Right.
You start off at ground zero, and you stack up against like a fighter, a rogue, and a wizard. Level. What is it? When do wizards learn Fireball? Like 4 or 5?
It's a 3rd level spell slot. So yeah, I think level 5 or 6.
Yeah, so that's when you get your fighter's extra attack. He's got action surge, so he can essentially hit 4 times. But your wizard's also doing insane damage, and then your rogue is over there doing sneak attack. Like you try to get what the averages are, and you kind of balance them out. What the average damage is, and that's if they hit.
Exactly. You know what? I'm really glad that you brought up Fireball, because Fireball is what I like to call my insanity barometer, because one thing that's really good for aspiring DMs or people who are trying to work homebrew content into their game is Fireball is a ridiculously overpowered spell. That's true. That's objective. And not only is it objective, the people who left it in as the way it was know that. It was kind of like a wink to the previous editions. And so we know for a fact Fireball is considered an insanely overpowered spell. Right. And so I use that as my line. Like if I'm going to homebrew something, when I play test it, it can never be more devastating than Fireball at that level. If I'm doing, a 6th, 7th, 8th level crazy spell, sure. But if I'm doing like a regular spell that is a lower level and can be scaled like Fireball, Fireball is my barometer for what's an acceptable thing. Right. I think that it's a pretty good scale to use since, 8d6 is fucking outrageous for 3rd level.
Right, exactly. That's nowhere near what a rogue can do during sneak attack at that same level. Right. They're doing maybe with short swords 4d6.
Right, and Fireball's also a fucking AoE.
Yeah, and it's a dex save, right? So it's always going to hit.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like...
Right. So, I mean, that's kind of where... if you're afraid to homebrew, what are some examples you would recommend, like to start off? Like you want to spice up the game, what do you do?
Well, so I think that, like you had brought up, there are 2 kind of big parts of homebrewing, but I think that for people afraid to homebrew, the easiest gateway to homebrewing is literally just changing wording on something existing. I think that doing things like that is really what's going to kind of get you into the mindset that it's acceptable to even do that. Like if you have somebody who wants something to do something, look at a spell that's similar and just say, okay, it does basically what the word says, but it looks different or requires an additional or different piece to it. Or instead of this damage, it's this damage because like, oh, instead of acid damage, this spell is basically the same, but it's rays of light because it's my lawful good paladin casting something similar. And then you're not even really mechanically looking at necessarily the balance of something. You're saying, okay, this is an acceptable thing to be cast by somebody already. Why don't I just change the wording to make it align with being a lawful good paladin thing that they can cast, and then you just attach it to a weapon and give it a once per long rest qualifier. That's probably the easiest barrier to entry, because chances are you're going to be fine if you just give it once a day.
Right. Yeah, and a good example I have of that too is I have a Warforged, and he's a fighter, and he has a subclass of what was it? It was that Ranger class, that Ranger subclass. I think it was, I can't remember the name of it right now, to be honest.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, but essentially he can shoot arrows with magical abilities, right? Like he has special arrows that like do acid damage or bind you or something like that. And to kind of fit the story, like I flavored it that he had little cartridges in his body that he would dispense and use those to equipped on his arrows to use. So he produced it, like his body produced this necrotic damage or these binding arrows. So it wasn't magic, it was like technology based, you know?
Right.
Like stuff like that is like super easy to flip because it's not changing any damage, it's not doing anything crazy, you know, you're making something more interesting that way.
And then the other thing, I think that one huge thing that a lot of people kind of dipping their toe in the water on homebrewing, and I say this trying to say it like with confidence, like, oh, I know better, but really it's just from experience with my fucking, you guys, you fucking assholes. You can't just consider in combat for balancing, which is a mistake I think a lot of homebrew tends to have. Like there's, you know, that D&D wiki that has a whole homebrew section full of 8 million things, and I've had, and I'm sure you've had, players submit like pages from that, and you're like, okay, this almost looks good, but like this doesn't consider the fact that this can occur. But out of combat is like 70% of D&D. So if you give them something that may be balanced for combat, but if they're trying to do something like diplomatic, it's just an insane advantage. You have to consider that and accept the fact that your players will find a way to break anything you do. So you also need to be willing to balance on the fly.
Yeah, and I think for any, you know, new DMs out there who might be interested in it, don't be afraid to go back on what you said was okay, because if you're noticing some insane things going on, don't be afraid to reach out to that player and be like, hey bud, let's talk about this 2d8 fucking longsword with 2d4 poison damage you got here, because this seems pretty overpowered. You know, never be afraid to go back on it.
Or just add a curse to it.
Oh god, yeah. So it was a good sword, all right. It was a good sword. But yeah, so that's the simplest way to implement any homebrew. And I think once you step into that light, or in that exercise of intrigue, you're going to really open yourself up to, you know, subclasses that are homebrewed, tinkering with your own classes and seeing how they work in game, and, you know, going into, you know, the more complex homebrew, you know, and the biggest one being characters. You know, you can create a whole new class and play it. It's been done before. There's hundreds of thousands of people out there who do it, you know.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So there is I mean, Wizards of the Coast even do it. You know, the Artificer was originally, I think, a homebrew, and then it became Unearthed Arcana twice, and then it got published in 2 different books. So it was like updated after the fact.
That's right. So, they finally published it in Eberron, right? And then Tasha's was just like, oh, here's 8 million additional things.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, oh, hey, we changed it, by the way. It's because it's an ever evolving game, and every single person's game is going to be different, and it's always about tweaking little things. So some examples. What comes to mind when you think of a complex homebrew? Then, if you think you think we're done with simple, we can move right into the complex.
I wouldn't even say the next stage is complex. I would say we have things like we discussed a little bit like flavor, but then there's even just things like little mechanical systems. Because the first thing that came to mind when you said that was the multiple many minions system that I had come up with for one of our encounters.
Well, that was a 4th edition thing.
Was it really?
Yeah, I brought it to you. I said, hey, in 4th edition...
I didn't know that it was in 4th edition. So
yeah.
The idea essentially is it's a swarm of things, and because it's a swarm, it has a plus X to attack.
Oh, your swarm thing. Yeah.
Okay. So the system that I came up with was it's a swarm of bats and it attacks. It has a plus what? Did my fucking soundboard just leave the Discord channel, motherfucker?
It did.
What a rude little bitch.
That's funny.
Hello, is anyone there? It literally AFK'd me. That's okay.
Funny.
So it's a swarm of bats, and because it's a large amount of bats, it has a plus 7 to hit. And its AC is quite low because it's a big swarm. So if you shoot an arrow into it, you're going to hit some of them. But as it gets lower in health, its plus to hit goes down because there's less of them attacking, but its AC goes up because you're shooting at a smaller target, essentially. Yeah. So scaling systems like that are a little bit more complex, and determining what the numbers of how much does the AC go up by how much HP is missing versus what the plus to attack would be.
Yeah, I think that in particular was a pretty ingenious monster design. It was something that definitely took me by surprise as its AC was slowly going up, and none of us could figure out why we couldn't fucking hit it. These fucking bats just attacking out of nowhere. That was definitely something I'm actually going to keep as in my DM repertoire.
I mean, honestly, I recommend that any DM use that, because when I designed that, I was just like, this is it's a universal mechanic that anybody can use, because you could even do something like low level players. It's like a +2 to attack. And like, you don't need to make this scale of like with those bats. You guys were like you were level I think 8 or 9 at the time, so it was like a +7 or 8 to attack, and then the AC was like a 12, and it just kind of went up from there. And the AC, I really just set a cap AC of like 22 or something, and a cap or a minimum on the plus to attack, which I think I just put at 0, but that is an example of implementing an entire new system into the game, but it's not overly complex because it doesn't necessarily change too much.
True.
And it kind of allows a single here's a little tip, I guess, to DMs. It kind of allows a single minion, meaning a single go in your action economy, like one thing for you to keep track of instead of a bunch, to kind of operate as a bunch. Because it's kind of a dynamic entity in the action economy. It's like, oh, they're hitting it a lot at first. Well, guess what? They're gonna miss it a lot at the end.
Yeah, and I think it's great because it's heavily rooted in realism. Like, if an actual swarm of bats hits you, eventually you're not going to be able to hit that last bat.
You know what, though? That's actually, I'm really glad that you said that, because that brings me into the first. I say the first thing as if it's a list that I didn't just come up with this idea off the top of my head right now, but it makes me think of the first thing that I want to pull from the field of cinematography, which is called verisimilitude. And verisimilitude essentially means if it makes sense within the context of the world, then the viewer is fine with it. So you also kind of want to balance things in terms of, does it make sense that would occur in the context of the setting of your campaign?
Exactly.
Like the bats, that makes perfect sense. But if I was just to have like a random dude walk up and his plus to hit and AC varied, it would not make sense, and everybody would be confused unless I could find a way to rationalize that.
Right,
so
exactly.
You also want to make sure your homebrews have verisimilitude within the world you've built.
Right. Because as soon as you break that immersion, then, you break the experience. You, the player, and you, the DM, are all in this magical land of make-believe, but something crazy pops up, mechanically speaking, and then your immersion's lost.
Exactly.
The world is no longer held together. But yeah, so I mean that, and I guess not even, this isn't, I don't know if this would be considered homebrew, but I love minions from 4th edition. 4th edition minions were 1 hit, 1 HP monsters that boosted your action economy. And for the DMs out there, action economy is probably one of the biggest things you want to balance. How many attacks does your party have, and how many attacks do your monsters have? Because if it's overwhelmingly high on one end or the other, someone's going to get fucked up. So minions is a great example of throwing those in. So if you have a dragon, you can have a bunch of kobolds that are minions that have 1 HP that are not going to fuck your party up, but they'll poke around at them, and it'll be a fair fight.
And if they don't deal with that threat, it will eventually chip away.
Exactly. It's like the grunts in Halo. They're super easy to kill, but in a herd, they're fucking dangerous.
Right. You have 6-7 guys doing 2-3-4 damage on a turn if they hit. Then over time, you have to deal with them. And one of the things that's just true about D&D players, both experienced and brand new, is they focus on the big bad in the room, and they kind of sort of let the minions do whatever they're trying to do, which is kind of funny to me. And so they don't often even realize that they probably have low AC and low HP, but taking an entire turn away from one of your players attacking the big bad guy gives you opportunity to kind of maneuver the fight in a way that's more favorable to the big bad guy getting to do nice, cool things.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's nothing worse than, I mean, it's not, I don't say worse. It's not that bad, but it definitely shakes up a game when your players ensnare a big bad guy and just take him out before he even finishes his speech.
There are few more devastating things than your bad guy just getting fucking dunked on right away that you spent 2 hours designing. Yeah,
exactly. I've had that happen to me, and Jake, if you're out there listening, you son of a bitch, you fucking killed. I think his name was Appalath. He was like a lieutenant of Bane or some shit, and they fucking murked him, man.
Yeah, and that's also additionally where, again, action economy is like a lot of DMs, because I know that I definitely did this earlier on, where CR was like my Bible. Challenge rating was like, I'd be like, they're level 6. This is challenge rating 8. This will be difficult for them to fight. But challenge rating is such a fast and loose system. It's pretty good in terms of just determining what scale they're at, but challenge rating, in my opinion, is not the perfect system for determining almost anything.
Don't follow that at all. I mean, it's great to kind of, my advice is, if you're going through the monster manual or you're looking for a monster, see what it does, because the health you can always adjust and the AC you can always adjust
instantly too. You can do that on the fly.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things, is always adjusting the HP to make a fight a little bit longer and more thematic. That's
also more meaningful.
Right.
Because there is merit as a player to just sweeping through a room full of guys, but feeling no degree of challenge whatsoever can become very frustrating very quickly.
Right, exactly. And I think, that's in line with a simple to complex range of homebrew is pulling. Now, I'm going to be showing my hand here, but I fucking love oozes and mimics just because they come out of nowhere. but you can tweak them to make them more interesting. Like the thing I like to do is take oozes, and traditionally slashing damage multiplies them. I like to keep their health high so that there's a fuck ton of them. So by the time they're halfway done with the fight, there's 8 oozes from one, and it's just like, oh my fucking god, there's ghouls coming after us. We need to get rid of this ooze now. So changing what a monster does, just because it's the rule of cool, right? Like if it's, as long as your players can kill them, or at least you can kill one of your players and make it a challenge, then more power to you, because it's not only is it a challenge, but you're adjusting the rules on a fly. You're adjusting the things it can do, and my biggest piece of advice is to always look at what they can do. The rule of cool will always be number one for me. Like if a monster is fucking cool and I want it to be on a different monster, I'll have that ability moved over to another monster. Or even if a player does something cool, it's always like, all right, let's see how this can be accomplished for, a more fun experience.
Right.
But I mean, that's kind of not only my advice, but like in the middle range of homebrewing your own thing. It's adjusting on the fly too.
Oh yeah. And also just take literally an existing thing and call it something else. Like the number of like CR like quarter or eighth or like little low level shithead guys, like they're kind of limited in my opinion in terms of like what like areas you believe they exist. So whatever fits in your world, just say this is what you see and then use an existing stat block. Like the player is like, and this is actually this happens to every DM, but like I've had campaign sessions where my players fight something, and then after the campaign one of the players goes, I thought that the creature only had this level AC and I didn't hit when I hit him with that level. And all my instant response is, you're cheating by even asking. Like your player doesn't know what AC is, so you asking me that is an irrelevant question.
Right.
Like, and none of my players follow, or none of my monsters ever have the exact stat block from SRD, because a lot of my players read these things like as hobbyists. Like they all are interested, so they know what ways to determine this thing is this creature. Like if it's shapeshifter and it smells like sulfur, for example, I would make it so mine doesn't smell like sulfur, because a player can almost in some ways not help but metagame in little ways like that. So I just make it so that way they can't, because that's not true for my guy.
Yeah, I think unless your player has knowledge of the monster in that world, it's keeping that verisimilitude again. But the big thing there too is, who's to say goblins aren't leveling up too? What if you want goblins and you're running a level 10 campaign or a one shot? Who's to say that your fucking goblins aren't beefed up?
Exactly.
If you like playing with them, figure out, read their tactics or invent your own. What do these goblins do? Are they burrowers? Are they Viet Cong like tree hunters? Are they trappers? Are they beast masters? Something to spice that up is to give them wargs, or give them some hobgoblins or some other crazy tools to fight your players with, but also boost them up, because these goblins have been around for a while and have been fucking people up, and they're stronger than the normal goblin.
Exactly. Like if somebody in a town tells you there's a goblin scourge that's like in the area for the last like 6 months, you can't imagine that these are just like baseline goblins. Like they've probably over that time have had some sort of knowledge or experience gained, and then I will do things like add to their damage and +2 attack. Like if they're a D4, now they're a D8. If they're a +1 to hit, now they're a +5.
Right. And that's what I don't think goblins have pack tactics, do they? I think that's kobolds, I want to say. Give them pack tactics. I believe
that's correct. Yeah, exactly. And you know what? You're allowed to, which is great.
Yeah. Do what feels right and what's fun. Don't go overboard though. As soon as you realize you're you're attacking your party way too much, don't be afraid to loosen up a little bit and be like, "Oh, these guys are almost dead." Yeah, you got it, guys. Keep going.
Right. If on round 3 you got a player character who's at half HP, maybe their +8 to attack becomes a +4 or something like that.
Show a little mercy, unless you've been playing a 6-year-long campaign, in which case your players might already know your style.
Exactly. And you know what? That level of dynamic balance is something that you'll kind of develop as you start implementing homebrew into your game. And as we, progress through this podcast and kind of discuss homebrew theory and what does make something balanced versus not, those rules are scalable in every direction. So they'll also help with your improvisational homebrew tweaks to make it more interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I honestly would say don't be afraid to look back a couple of editions either.
Easily.
One perfect example, aside from minions, which is interesting to implement, is bloodied. In 4th edition, there was this condition called bloodied, and when a creature reached half hit points, something crazy would happen. In some cases, some things would go berserk and do more damage. That's a great way if you have, your party stomping on everything. You can have something go bloodied and just rage on them. Now they're doing twice as much damage. You make it thematic. Make it fit and make them scared to kind of fuck with these next time.
And honestly, you can take things like that, like mechanics, and thematically be like, oh, this could mean that. So a perfect way to make your party terrified is make some guys that have that, once they reach half, they go berserk and do double damage or take more attacks or whatever. Make them a masochistic group too, where they're like, yeah, bring the heat. if your players are if they want me to hit them, I don't know if I should hit them. Things like that are also really good to add into for flavor.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then so going into our kind of next subject here, then, if you want, we can go into.
I have one more little thing, which is huge, and it's also your party, the world is yours as the DM, but your party is the game as the DM. So another really good thing, since we were on improvisation for a minute there. Don't be afraid to literally throw a plan in the garbage. A perfect example for that for me is in our campaign, there was a point where the players were navigating through a goblin-protected cave, and they approached it in a Splinter Cell style. They stealthed, they took aim, and they took these goblins out. Now, in the original design that I had on paper, there were measures taken into account for things like any sort of one of them dying would have caused a horde to swarm. But me as the DM, 2 things occurred. I didn't prepare the party for the fact that they might die here well enough because they approached it willy-nilly, and that's on me. And 2, the way that you guys went about it was so sick that I was just like, oh, yeah, no, this is better. Let's see how this goes. And I just threw away the horde of goblins that existed. I was like, this is way better. Fuck what I had. Let's go with that.
Yeah, and you can always, any mechanics you develop, you can play again later in another scenario. Don't be afraid to keep them for later, because something like that, again, the rule of cool trumped that shit. We went in with bows drawn and pierced multiple goblins. We were so in sync. It was so sick.
It was literally like SWAT team executing them.
Exactly.
And then it turned out that those goblins were important to a dragon. So
yeah.
But
consequences.
And then I'm gonna give my top secret little extra tip for DMs. This one's great, and it's maybe the best thing I ever implemented. I don't even know if you and I have discussed this, Nick. I'm a puzzles guy. I love puzzles. My party hates puzzles.
Hate puzzles.
They get instantly angry. Nick's character Zelonis often will destroy a thing instead of solving a puzzle. What I've started doing, and every DM really should do this, I make a puzzle, I come up with an approximate solution I expect, and then I just sort of throw the puzzle at them and wait until they've satisfied me. It doesn't have to be anything I devised. If they come up with something clever enough that is good enough to satisfy me, you've solved the puzzle now. You don't have to find my exact solution. You just need to be clever for a minute.
Exactly. And I love that. I love that you say that too, because I'm somewhat the same way. But when it comes to interactions, like the whole thing what you did with the evil campaign, speaking with Marcus, the only way I had to get information to the wizard was speaking to the barkeep. No one spoke to the barkeep. You decided to speak to a random contact, and I was like, okay, this is cool, and we're going to do this now.
Well, exactly, and that's the other thing, too. Don't be afraid to switch which, NPC has information.
Exactly. It's always evolving. If your players do something cool, reward them. Don't ever hold them back by gating something off to certain PCs or NPCs or certain dice rolls or anything. Don't ever lock them away.
Right. Let anything be possible, and let that almighty nat 20 roll really shine in those moments where it matters.
All right. Before we digress into a whole spate of different awesome tips we could provide, let's go a little bit more into complex homebrews. Something that I think you and I have had a lot of in-depth conversations about. It's specifically classes. One of the biggest homebrew challenges is making a whole new class. Oh, yeah. So some of the reasons you might want to do this is obviously to spice the game up. But the biggest thing when it comes to balance for anything class related, you don't ever want to undermine another class, because you're just stepping on someone else's toes, you know? Like, you have the Rogue 2.0. It's like, why play a rogue when you could play this? Or why play, a fighter when you can play this?
Oh, absolutely. And in that case, then just make like a fighting stance or some subclass or archetype or something.
Right, exactly. If you like 90% or even 80, maybe 75%, if you like 75% of a class but want it to be better in some way, just do a subclass. Start with a subclass, or start with a feat. Start with something different to spice that up a little bit. But when you're doing classes, try to look online. There's a lot of good classes out there you can start from. Some things you might not even, that might not even cross your mind. Like, I think yours and mine class we recently spoke about was I think it was a Dreamweaver or something like that.
Oh, the Insomniac.
That's what it was. So the whole premise of the class was your player could not sleep. Like, they specifically,
you had to roll for quality of sleep. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It was a hard mode class to be a hard mode class. It was essentially bending the fabric of your dreams and nightmares to become like a demonic summoner, essentially.
Right.
Like, you summoned your nightmares to fight for you.
Exactly.
But in order to use your nightmares, you'd have to have nightmares, but you can't sleep because there's like a penalty.
Right.
It was a weird balance of taking levels of exhaustion in order to be more powerful. So it was a power balance.
Exactly. Like, anybody who's ever been sleep deprived and they're walking through a dark hallway, and on the periphery of your vision you see those little like shadows moving, like what they call them, shadow creatures. I mean, the entire idea came from the notion that I personally, in real life, am an insomniac, and I'm always fucking sleep deprived. And so I was walking down the hallway once, and I saw the shadow creatures, and I was just like, it'd be so sick if I could summon them. And then the idea is I only could summon them I like thought about this. I was like, I actually could only do this if I was fucking exhausted. Like if I didn't get any sleep and I was in a shitty mood and tired and everything sucked, then I could summon them. And that kind of idea is like really cool because you have that trade-off, right? Like if you roll really well and you get a great night's sleep, you're weaker the next day, but you're more functional. You don't have a level of exhaustion.
And this was the great part, was because I had the dream of having the dreams, become something that you use. And I think I came to you, and then you told me about that insomnia thing, and I was like, that's perfect. Fuck the dream idea. Let's combine that. So a lot of these things.
That's exactly how that came to pass.
Yeah, because my original thought was, you have a dream. And whatever you dream of, kind of like the beholder. Now that I think about it, the beholder, whenever it decides to sleep, it summons shit depending on what it dreams about. It just summons it into existence. Like, what if that was a class? How fun would that be to play? And then I think we merged that with Insomniac, which I think if we actually went along with it, it might be OP, because there's a lot of things to consider when you do your own class. As complex as it can be, you can base it off of other classes and kind of gauge, each level. Right. But there's always going to be those items, and we circle back around to where we first started about items and roll tables, like it's a perfect circle. Your intention doesn't matter. It's about what the player does. The player will take anything and think of things that you would have never anticipated this class to be used as. Right. Whether that be with like random items you throw at them, you're going to sit there and be like, well, fuck, this is why this doesn't work. So there's so much. As a game, I don't think D&D is very balanced. I don't think it's a game that's perfectly balanced by any means, but it works the way it is. Right. Throwing a wrench into it that's lit on fire and also explodes on contact, that's something different. So creating your own class is kind of what that is. But again, when you create your own class, you could always do like a one shot or a short, a couple session campaign, run a module, for crying out loud.
Yeah, you have to play test it, especially when doing a very complex thing like a whole class. Like, fuck, look at how long Artificer was in playtesting officially from Wizards before it was released.
Years. It was years, I think. Yeah.
And I went through, I think, 6 different playtest iterations that were published for people to try out.
Right, exactly. It's never going to be perfect, but if that class isn't outshining everyone or underperforming, then I think you've done a good job. I mean,
we didn't finish that class either, so maybe within following episodes we work on pieces of it, and maybe we flesh that whole class out here on the podcast, and then that'll allow people to get a little bit of insight into how the creation process goes. Right.
The first things I think about is I forget who said like 90% of D&D players or campaigns don't last beyond level 10, maybe even 5. So technically, I mean, you could create a class that only lives up to level 5 or 10. So anything above that, everyone's got crazy actions. Even a basic fighter man's got, more actions than a level 1. At level 10, I can do fucking 12 things. So it gets complicated as you get higher up in level, and then the balance just goes out the fucking window when it gets past 10. So, you can start really small too. You can start the first 5 levels are this, or even the first couple 3 or this, run a module, test it out, see how it runs,
Right. Although you saying that just did give me an idea for an insanely sick, like, maybe the most complex mechanic I ever thought of that I don't know if I even want to go into on the pod, but maybe we take offline. But I'll say is, think of not even a full class, right? Like a mastery class, meaning you can't even take levels in it until you're level 10, and then there's only 3, 4, 5 levels of that like mastery class.
So that essentially would be like multi-classing, wouldn't it?
It would be multi-classing, but you would forego a lot of the perks of a regular class's level increases to specifically hone in on particular things. Like a mastery class for wielding two-handed swords, it could maybe give you extra hits, extra attacks, extra this, extra that, but you're not getting like the boons of your fighter class level ups. You're not going to get that +2 ability score. You're not going to get that pick a feat thing.
It's like a late bloomer, or like November when December comes along, you know, you're blasting big ones.
It's almost like a class specialty. Rather than taking a level in an actual class, you're using it almost as a point to give your existing thing a boon.
Right, exactly. I think that's interesting.
It would need to be fleshed out.
Exactly. And I think we could definitely do that off. I mean, maybe
we don't have to do it this second. It doesn't have to be anytime soon. It's just an idea that randomly came to me, so we can definitely discuss it. And it might suck later. Like I might hate it in 10 minutes. That's the other thing too. Don't be afraid to just flat throw shit away.
Oh,
don't get too fucking attached to it. Yeah. The number of things I've started creating and it was just like, nah, fuck it. And I just moved on.
Yeah. See, my specialty is balancing items out. A lot of the easiest things to do, like we said, is items, right? We give our players items for character background stories. So balancing that out is super easy. That's my specialty. Well, yeah. Once you get the hang of it, like giving somebody an extra ability that's from their own like racial abilities, like you can shape change twice as much now, or you can druid shape a little bit more.
Easy, but like Orum's shield that he can either choose to have it throw in boomerang, or he can like throw it in an arc in a circle around him as an AoE from his point of existence, like.
Yeah, that was weird. That was a hard one.
Yeah, that was a mechanics that don't really exist style addition. But he was creating a 9th level character. Like we couldn't make it some low level lame bullshit.
Yeah, and even his subclass is a homebrew, isn't it?
I believe so. I mean, I know that Darius's character, Modera's character Darius, is his archetype for his ranger is a fully homebrewed subclass that he made himself and submitted multiple iterations of it to me, and him and I talked about why what things were or weren't balanced, and in honestly there were even some cases where he undersold certain things, like, oh, this is a D4. Yeah. I'll be like, I'll give you a D6 actually, but this and this. And so he submitted a whole subclass for his ranger that is now canon in our world and exists as his ranger subclass within the game. But that took us about 3 weeks to get it fully good.
Yeah, and that's another thing too for you guys out there. If it makes sense narratively, or even if you want to spin it, you know, you can introduce subclasses later in the game, because Darius, you know, he died. He was a regular ranger. He died, came back to life, and became this Shadow Stalker ranger subclass, which, you know, thematically was fucking fantastic, and it was a homebrew subclass. Like, don't be afraid to throw that in the middle of your game if you've got a fighter, and even if he just wants to be, you know, a warlock, all of a sudden something happens and he's a warlock now, or something crazy. Right. You know, don't be afraid to spice up your game in any way, shape, or form. Go fucking crazy. And as soon as you realize you've gone too far, always remember, you don't be fucking afraid to reach your players and be like, hey man, this is OP. Like when I told you about the swords, I was like, dude, I'm doing 50 damage on average per turn. And you're like, yeah, I know.
To be fair, that sword was always cursed. Like, it was overpowered for a reason. The whole point was to really make you want to swing it.
Oh yeah. Oh god, yeah.
And then basically the sword gives him a bloodlust, and the DC to break it goes up with each successful hit on something. And so essentially when he swings the sword, he has a DC 14 to let it go, and if he fails, then he has to swing. He needs to attack the closest thing to him. Doesn't matter if it's friend or foe. And if he hits, the DC to let it go is 15. And that goes up. It resets when he eventually does let it go. But as he's holding it and as he swings, like if he uses it in a fight, he's attacking something. He hits, 4 or 5 times. We're now at DC 19 when the fight's over to let that thing go and not attack his partner.
Oh yeah. That just to give you guys reference, that sword was a 2d8 plus 2 plus 2d4, and when you crit, you get an extra 4 poison damage.
Right.
So on top of my already fucking 20 strength, I was destroying things. So it fit for my character to want to use it and be okay with the bloodlust, until it got removed. But,
which was a process in and of itself.
It was. It really was. It was a whole side mission thing. But
get to a hidden city, whatever.
And that's just another example of a good mechanic to implement. For curses. Anything small. But yeah, the whole complexity of homebrewing. It really goes down to what you're comfortable with, and then once you're ready for it, take the leap into classes and subclasses. Start off with basic changing of stats for monsters, basic stuff for weapons and items and stuff, and then go into more of the more interesting things like curses or whatnot, and then subclasses, and then just go ham on some fucking classes. See what you like. There's nothing stopping you from making your game the best game you want it to be. Like, make the game you want.
Yeah, exactly. And
it's
one
your
thing
fucking
I will
game.
say though about creating a whole homebrew class, because of the amount of genuine, like, if I'm giving a ballpark estimate to create a fully fleshed out class, and I'm not talking like Fighter plus every expansion book's additions to Fighter, just Fighter in the 5e Player's Handbook.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking 40, 50 hours of genuine work, not including any playtesting.
Oh God, yeah.
Like it's a lot. So one important question that you really want to ask yourself, and you know what, I'll even go beyond adding this to making a whole class. Really ask yourself this before you homebrew anything. What is this bringing to the table that an existing thing does not? Because there's also times where the easiest solution is take a spell that already exists, change what it looks like, who can cast it, and what the components are, and use that in place, and then you don't really need to do any work. If you have an idea that's like, oh, this brings an interesting thing, like this, I think that the class was Insomniac. I think Dreamweaver was one of the subclasses we thought of.
Maybe.
The mechanic, because I think that you brought that to me, and I was like, that fits perfectly with this crazy idea that I had, and it literally within the same like day that we both just thought of this idea that just was seamless together. It brought something to the table that like doesn't really exist. Is like most of the time, like sleeping or long rests, unless they're like in hostile territory, it's like, oh, this dude meditates. And even if you have a player who meditates for 4 hours, they typically just, I wait for the extra 4. So they don't even utilize that time in any way. So making the notion of sleep be part of the mechanic of how a player operates from day to day is something that none of the other classes really bring to the table in that way.
Right. It's something that it's not typically looked at. You rest. If you don't rest, you're exhausted. And you can approach anything in the world mechanic wise and say, hey, let's tie this to a class like just ballparking, pitching ideas. Traveling. Nobody gives a shit about traveling. what if you had a class that's specialized in traveling? Something fucking weird like that.
Sure.
Like every time he travels, he gets stronger, so he has to go out a mile and back to become stronger, or some weird shit like that. You know, mechanics that don't get attention, you can always, you know, tie something to it to make it interesting.
Right.
Because the matter of the fact is, the three pillars, you know, essential pillars of D&D is combat, diplomacy, and exploration, you know, and everything else falls in between those, you know. So why not make a class that plays with that?
Absolutely. And much in the way that like a monk always wants to be kind of low hit points, it's like it stands to reason that there could be a class that always wants to be a level of exhaustion, like something that people generally try and avoid. Having that be like a prerequisite for the best version of your character really adds some interesting flavor to situations.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, you don't have to go, like we said again, you don't have to go full ham. You know, my I think I explained this a little bit, the flavoring, you know, that's a great start. I have a low magic campaign that I have brewing up. Again, a whole campaign I'm homebrewing. Is there's no magic. And the only way you can cast magic is by harnessing, you know, the magic blood of creatures. So it's essentially all spellcasters don't cast magic traditionally, so they have to use blood magic. You know, it's something, it's a flavor, you know, it ties it into that world, and it makes it more alive. It makes it your own.
Right. In general, don't be afraid to abandon high fantasy entirely.
Exactly.
I have an idea for a Western setting, and one campaign that I really do want to design, like my next full-fledged design campaign, is going to be a fully modern one that exists kind of in modern day, modern world, but with all of the things that we know and love from D&D in some form or fashion.
Right, exactly. That'd be great, you know. But yeah, I mean, go out, adventure, figure out what you like to do, you know, whether that be doing minor tweaks, making items, making an entire world. Brew your shit, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, don't be afraid to play around with it, and also don't be afraid to throw it to 500 of your friends who play and just be like, what do you think of this? Like,
oh yeah,
get input on it, do some play testing on it, and get creative with it for sure.
Absolutely.
I think we're at about an hour here.
I think so, yeah.
All right. So that wraps it up, I guess, for episode 0 of Dragon Brews.
Yeah, and depending on if this airs, I hope you guys enjoyed it and stick around for what comes next.
Absolutely. And cut, I guess.